D&D was the first tabletop RPG I played in university. In fact, I never played an RPG, specifically tabletop, before in my entire life. I played a lot of Japanese role-playing games, and I watched a lot of cartoons and anime, which were definitely influenced by the most popular tabletop RPG, but I never played Dungeons & Dragons or any kind of tabletop RPG. And I know going into university, bonding with people was already a difficult enough time, but I also know that the reason I fell in love with video games and books and cartoons was because there was sometimes media representation. And as an LGBTQ+ person, specifically a queer person, media representation meant a whole lot. In fact, LGBTQ youth especially can benefit from having that representation, and without it, can often foster lower self-esteem. However, this media representation can often be one-dimensional and stereotypical, and also ignores LGBTQ+ subgroups and communities. So, how does that have anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons? Well, that's because I think D&D and any and all tabletop RPGs can be a great way to explore your queer and trans identity, or at the very least, expose you to the multitude of experiences that are out there. So today, gamers, on this awesome Pride Month, we're going to be discussing how Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop RPGs overall can be helpful in exploring queerness and trans identities. To establish that, let's discuss a bit of D&D and nerd culture, as well as the history of Dungeons & Dragons. So if you've been in the RPG scene, you have some idea of how Dungeons & Dragons was first founded. Well, D&D was made by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in the early 1970s and was pulled from wargaming in mind. Also, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson throughout the creation pulled from wargame tropes and especially pulp narratives. So, folks like Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft were big inspirations. Oftentimes the writers were, well, white folk from Western Europe, and most of the audience was, well, white middle-class guys in the suburbs. So when you have that backdrop and have that audience, Dungeons & Dragons is going to reflect that. And that can be seen in earlier editions of the GM and player books. For example, in the 1978 edition, there was a tradition of using mainly male pronouns, and also the maximum strength difference between men and women was an actual stat difference. Yikes. Plus, D&D's past history depicted Polynesian and Asian communities in otherwise extremely not positive light, as I've covered in this video. So overall, D&D's history has been checkered, and is going to kind of affect the audience and the people who played, even in contemporary. And I'm not here to excuse that crappy behavior, but to establish what is the foundation of Dungeons & Dragons, and subsequently so many other tabletop RPGs, history. All the things we love are created by human beliefs and ideas, and these ideas have blind spots, and D&D is certainly no exception to that rule. Fortunately, Dungeons & Dragons has greatly improved and included a large diversity of characters, bodies, and colors and shapes and sizes, which is awesome. And I implied this earlier, but D&D still has a reputation. That is, a reputation for being a hobby made for white nerdy guys from suburbs. And there is some truth to that. Quoting Daniel Ruse, "There's a certain racial coding to geek and or nerd culture. The required reading of geekdom, whether fantasy, Lord of the Rings, the Cthulhu mythos, or Conan, or science fiction, Hyperion, Dune, or Ender's Game, are novels that focus on predominantly white characters, featuring tokenism at best and downright racial animosity at worst. The canon of fantasy and sci-fi authors is overwhelmingly white," end quote. And I would argue that that canon is also assumedly straight and assumedly cis. And the problem with watching media, whether that be books, TV, or anything like that, they're assumed to be cis and het. And for queer and trans people growing up, or even wanting to see themselves in these media, they're not going to find themselves. So Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop RPGs offer a unique experience where we are able to take up the whole and represent ourselves. And I think that's what makes Dungeons & Dragons, and to that extent all tabletop RPGs, a beautiful time for queer and trans people. It is because we have that ability to explore our own identities and the identities of others around the table and represent ourselves however we want. D&D can be an emotional experience for us because we share a lot of ourselves via these games. And with D&D's growing popularity and the ability to create whatever kind of character you want and play in whatever world you want, identity becomes a big question for many of us, And for those who were struggling or are struggling with coming out, or coming out to their friends or family or someone specific to them, Dungeons and Dragons or a tabletop RPG can be a useful way to understand and compartmentalize your queer and trans experience. Also, it allows players to play with identity and see what works with them and what doesn't. For example, in the magazine An Injustice, Angela writes, "The system creates an opportunity to explore and play with identity. It removes the anxieties of reality and provides a space where someone can explore their gender or sexual identity without fear of rejection from other player characters or the game master. It's all part of the buy-in." End quote. And I think that buy-in into exploring your identities is what resonates with a lot of queer and trans people. It allows you to get outside of the isolated media consumption of, well, generic queer and trans characters who fit into very specific molds, and you can play the kind of character, world, or identity or style you want. Let's say you want to go on a space adventure in the newest Spelljammer book with you and the rest of your queer polycule. That's awesome as hell! Or what if you want to play a swashbuckling elf with a physical disability because those experiences resonate with you? Then hell yeah! Or if you, as the game master, want to include queer and trans characters, you can, and I personally recommend you should. You don't have to rely on anyone or any form of TV or media. You can start implementing that in your game now. And for players and GMs, that's an awesome time because at the end of the day, a game like tabletop RPGs, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, is about having fun. And if that fun includes representing yourself, then you should go for it. In fact, I recommend it extremely. Finally, Dungeons and Dragons is a way for queer and trans folks to bond over something outside of clubs and bar activities, because clubs and bars, while they are very much part of queer culture and have long since been a space for queer and trans resistance, not all of them are always the most accessible, and not everyone drinks or likes to go dancing or partying. For some people, Dungeons and Dragons might be one of the only times where they get to interact or bond with other queer and trans people outside of their day-to-day. Furthermore, Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop RPGs can serve as a way to engage with past trauma, wish fulfillment, and explore your identities, as I've said several times. So, D&D is a place for queer and trans people to explore whatever the heck they want. And it all depends on your comfortability level. Of course, while I do say Dungeons and Dragons is the perfect place to explore your identity, it's not always perfect, and there are definitely still lots of problems. Of course, simply representation is not all we need within queer or trans spaces, and Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop RPGs are not going to solve all of the several issues we got going on. And I don't need to be bearer of bad news, but there is still plenty of transphobia and homophobia within these tabletop RPG spaces, especially since, well, gaming spaces can be a bit regressive at times, to say the least. And this isn't talking about the worker compensation and worker issues within major tabletop RPG companies, or worker pay, or unions, or anything like that, and the long hours some of them have to work. Also, simply representing queer and trans people doesn't fix the structural problems that many people are facing on material needs, just food, water, and shelter, especially if LGBTQ youth facing way more difficulties than, say, their straight counterparts. What I am saying is that D&D and tabletop RPGs can provide a safe and comfortable environment to explore your own identities, and to that extent, I think serves a great purpose for bonding and building community. Dungeons & Dragons isn't perfect, but I think it's one of those games that help me to better understand myself, and whenever I'm trying to get others into the hobby, it's always a great time, because at the end of the day, all of us deserve to be represented and loved and cared for. And if there's one thing I know, I roll dice because at the end of the day, everyone deserves to feel proud for themselves and for the people in their table. If that means playing that horny bard, or the himbo barbarian, then I absolutely think you should do it. I'm your average, not so everyday, queer host, Blurty Disposition. I hope you all have an awesome day. And if you like this content, be sure to like. If you disliked it, also be sure to dislike. I'm here and queer. I hope you all have an awesome Pride Month. Ciao!